Hello, dear listeners of Z Sci-Fi Stories, and thank you from the bottom of our hearts for tuning in today. Recently, YouTube has completely disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us without the operating budget needed to keep bringing you these adventures. If you find today's story captivating, we kindly ask you to support us with just $1, so we can pay our hard-working staff, help them cover their daily living expenses, and continue creating the stories you love. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen, or by clicking the PayPal link in the video description or pinned comment below. The universe does not hate the weak, it simply does not notice them. For a 12-year-old girl standing alone on a dying world, the silence of a closing door was louder than any weapon. She was not hunted. She was simply erased by an algorithm, left to freeze in the toxic dust while the warmth of the only home she knew was sealed away forever. The towering titanium gates of Ecodome Aegis 7 slid shut with a deafening, metallic groan, followed by the heavy, final thud of the magnetic locks engaging. Outside those colossal walls, the world was a sprawling, poisoned wasteland of rusted metal dunes and jagged synthetic rock. Standing at the base of the gate, looking up at a structure so massive it pierced the bruised, smog-choked clouds, was Lyra. She was 12 years old, an alien child whose skin naturally emitted a soft, bioluminescent purple glow. Right now, that glow was flickering, dimming against the overwhelming darkness of the outer exclusion zone. Lyra pressed her small, gloved hands against the frozen metal of the dome, her breath fogging the inside of her oversized, cracked helmet. Inside that dome was warmth, clean oxygen, and the small, cramped maintenance closet she had shared with her mother. But her mother had passed away just 24 hours ago, the moment her mother's heart stopped. The corporate AI overseeing Aegis 7 registered a deceased laborer, with no primary asset left to contribute to the workforce quotas. The system automatically revoked the dependent labor residency card attached to Lyra. There were no guards dispatched to beat her. There was no cruel warden shouting orders. The automated security protocols merely locked her out of her quarters, guided her through the lower maintenance corridors with flashing neon signs, and cycled her out of the primary airlock. It was a perfectly efficient, entirely emotionless execution carried out by lines of cold code. The corporation did not care enough to kill her. It just let the planet do the work. The ambient temperature was plummeting rapidly, racing toward absolute freezing. The sky above churned into a sickly mix of violent greens and deep blacks as a massive electrostatic storm gathered on the horizon. The wind began to howl, picking up razor-sharp particles of metallic sand that scoured against Lyra's frayed environmental suit. Shivering violently, the little girl curled into a tight ball at the base of the dome's massive foundation. To survive the encroaching frost, she clutched a small, cylindrical therm drive against her chest. It was the only keepsake her mother had left behind. Unlike standard corporate tech, which hummed with a sterile, high-pitched whine, this device pulsed with a strange, deep rhythm. It felt like a mechanical heartbeat, radiating a faint, comforting heat that barely kept the blood flowing in her extremities. Suddenly, a jagged arc of blue lightning shattered the sky. The electrostatic storm had arrived. The atmospheric pressure dropped so violently that Lyra was thrown sideways off the concrete foundation and tumbled down into the loose, metallic sand dunes. A sharp beep echoed inside her helmet. Her hand-me-down rebreather unit, already flashing a red warning light, finally clicked dry. The oxygen stopped flowing. The filtration mesh failed, and the heavy, sulfur-laden air of the wasteland seeped into her mask. Lyra gasped, choking on the toxic fumes. Her lungs burned as if she had inhaled shattered glass. Her vision blurred, the edges of the world turning black. Her bioluminescence faded to a ghostly, pale violet. Her tiny fingers went completely numb, and the pulsing therm drive slipped from her grasp, rolling several feet away down the slope of the dune. She reached for it, but her body refused to move. The cold was paralyzing. She closed her eyes, letting the heavy silence of the wasteland take over. Then, the ground vibrated. The distinct, guttural roar of a heavy combustion engine tore through the screaming wind. A massive armored rover, scarred by years of acid rain and sandstorms, crested the dune. Its heavy treads churned the metallic sand into the air, throwing blinding spotlights across the wasteland. The machine slammed its brakes, sliding to a halt just a few yards from Lyra's collapsing form. The heavy pneumatic door of the rover hissed open. Out stepped Ernest Bruno. He was a human, a man with a deeply lined, weathered face, clad in a ragged, patched-together survival suit. He looked like the wasteland itself, hardened and entirely devoid of pity. Ernest was a scavenger, and the first law of the rust dunes was simple. You never waste precious oxygen or rations on a dying creature. He looked down at the tiny, glowing girl bleeding out into the sand, his expression unreadable. He took a step backward, preparing to return to his vehicle and leave her to the storm. But as he turned, his flashlight swept over the cylindrical device lying in the dirt. The therm drive. Ernest paused. He squinted through his visor, stepping closer. The casing had cracked open slightly in the fall, revealing a complex, labyrinthine network of microcircuitry that defied all known corporate engineering standards. It was alien technology, far more advanced than a simple heater. A deafening crack of thunder shook the earth, a wall of crackling blue energy. The eye of the electrostatic storm was rushing toward them, tearing up the landscape in its path. Ernest looked at the device, then looked at the dying girl. He cursed under his breath, abandoning all the survival rules that had kept him alive for decades. The old scavenger lunged forward. He scooped the heavy therm drive into his pocket, grabbed the fragile alien girl by the harness of her suit, and threw her into the rover's airlock. He threw himself in right behind her, slamming his fist onto the emergency seal button. "Hold on!" Ernest yelled over the chaotic noise. He ripped the throttle backward. The rover's rear jet thrusters ignited with a blinding burst of fire. The heavy vehicle launched forward, tearing away from the dome just a fraction of a second before the monstrous wall of static lightning annihilated the very patch of sand where the little girl had laid. Lyra's eyes fluttered open. The immediate sensation was not the biting frost she expected, but the heavy, suffocating scent of machine oil, burnt ozone, and stale sweat. She found herself wrapped tightly in a thick thermal blanket, lying on a cold, metal grate floor. Surrounding her were towering piles of rusted gears, scavenged circuit boards, and thick bundles of dangling wires. The low, rhythmic vibration humming beneath her bones told her the massive machine was in motion. She bolted upright, her breath catching painfully in her throat. Sitting across the cramped, dimly lit cabin was the human. Humans were the absolute overseers, the merciless enforcers of the ecodomes. They wore crisp uniforms and carried electric batons to keep the alien laborers in strict line. This man, Ernest, looked like a creature forged entirely from the wasteland dust and thick grease. But he was undeniably human. Her bioluminescence flared with a jagged, panicked intensity, casting sharp, terrified shadows against the chaotic clutter of the cabin walls. Ernest did not lunge toward her. He did not bark a single cruel command. He simply sat in his worn leather pilot seat, holding a silver foil packet. With a slow, deliberate motion, he tossed the package onto the floor near her small boots. It was a standard synthetic nutrient block. His eyes, framed by deep wrinkles and years of harsh survival, held no malice, only a weary, silent indifference. Lyra hesitated for a long moment, her stomach cramping violently with hunger. She carefully reached out her trembling fingers and took the packet. She desperately wanted to say thank you, to plead for her safety, but her vocal cords were simply not designed for the harsh, guttural consonants of the human tongue. Instead, she closed her eyes and let her glowing skin speak for her. The frantic, jagged flashes of panicked purple smoothed out, transitioning into a soft, undulating rhythm, mimicking the gentle rolling of a quiet sea. It was the bioluminescent dialect of her people, expressing deep gratitude mixed with cautious curiosity. Ernest chewed thoughtfully on the unlit end of a synthetic cigar, his eyes locked on the mesmerizing display. He recognized it instantly, not as a random biological reaction, but as a highly structured syntax. He saw a complex language composed entirely of shifting wavelengths and measured light frequencies. A heavy, gravelly sigh escaped the old scavenger. He turned his heavy chair around and began rummaging through a plastic bin, overflowing with salvaged optical sensors. For the next 2 solid hours, the only sounds echoing in the cabin were the clinking of heavy metal tools and the steady, reassuring hum of the combustion engine. Ernest stripped thick copper wires with his teeth, carefully soldering a cracked optical lens to a battered military communication receiver he had looted years ago. He moved with the quiet, intensely focused brilliance of a master engineer, a stark and surprising contrast to his rugged, unkempt appearance. When he finally finished his task, he held up a crude, bulky collar constructed from scrap metal and reinforced glass. He gestured firmly for her to place it around her neck. Trembling slightly, Lyra obliged, feeling the cold metal against her warm skin. The primary lens aligned perfectly with her collarbone, capturing the ambient light her skin emitted. "Testing, receiving," Ernest muttered, his voice raspy and dry like dead leaves brushing against stone. Lyra responded by shifting her light pattern to a bright, inquisitive amber hue. The jury-rigged machine clicked, whirred loudly, and then a mechanized synthetic female voice filled the small cabin. "I understand you. Thank you for saving me." Ernest leaned back into his chair, a faint ghost of a smile touching the corners of his cracked lips. The terrifying silence between 2 vastly different species had finally been bridged. With the immediate tension somewhat eased, Lyra's hands suddenly began frantically searching the deep pockets of her frayed suit. Pure panic returned to her features, flashing a brilliant crimson warning across her skin. Ernest reached onto his main navigation console and held up the heavy, cylindrical device he had snatched from the sand. Lyra let out a visible sigh of relief, reaching her hands out to reclaim it. "Hold on just 1 second, kid." The mechanical translator relayed Ernest's spoken words, though he held the device firmly out of her desperate reach. He placed the cylinder under the harsh, white glare of his workbench examination light. "This is not a simple thermal drive. I have scavenged gear for 40 years. Your people do not build microprocessors layered with quantum entanglement threading." Ernest pulled a thick diagnostic cable from his central computer terminal and forcefully jacked it into a perfectly hidden, microscopic port on the cylinder's smooth side. The rover's monitors instantly went pitch black. A second later, they exploded into a blinding cascade of scrolling, aggressive red code. The entire operating system locked down immediately. It was a corporate military-grade encryption firewall, the kind used strictly for planetary defense secrets. Ernest's blood ran entirely cold. This was not a precious family heirloom meant to keep a child warm. It was a black box, a heavily classified data cache brilliantly camouflaged within a shell of alien technology. Before the terrifying gravity of that discovery could fully set in, the rover's proximity radar shrieked. A high-pitched, piercing alarm bathed the dark cabin in flashing, rhythmic emergency lights. Ernest slammed his heavy hand onto the console, forcefully overriding the lock system to bring up the external camera feeds. High above the toxic, swirling clouds of the wasteland, 3 automated Predator drones were descending rapidly in a tight, aggressive triangular formation. These were not standard Border Patrol units searching for a stray, undocumented alien child. These were heavy suppression machines, equipped with thermal-piercing lasers and advanced tracking arrays tuned entirely to the unique quantum signature of the black box currently sitting on his desk. The corporation was actively hunting its stolen secrets, and they would annihilate anything standing in their way. Ernest stared at the blinking monitors, then looked slowly down at Lyra. If he dumped the alien girl and the mysterious box right here in the dirt, the drones would turn her into smoking ash within 10 seconds, and he could drive his rover away cleanly into the storm. That was the unyielding law of the wasteland. Look out for yourself and never carry dead weight. He gripped the control yoke tightly, his knuckles turning pure white under the ingrained grime. He looked back at the terrified child, her light pulsing in a desperate, fragile rhythm of pure fear and confusion. The deeply buried conscience of a man who had witnessed entirely too much death finally snapped violently back to life. Ernest ripped the thick diagnostic cable out of the black box, instantly severing the connection and masking the radioactive signal. "Strap into the seat tight," he barked, his voice filled with sudden adrenaline. He reached beneath the dashboard and flipped a row of heavy, red toggle switches. The entire rover shuddered violently as the external thermal dampeners activated, plunging the massive vehicle into complete, invisible stealth mode. He slammed the heavy gearshift forward, violently diving the machine away from the open plains and steering it forcefully toward the treacherous, jagged canyons that led straight down into the forgotten, dangerous subterranean underworld. The heavy rover plunged deep into the jagged throat of the canyon, descending far below the howling surface storms. The oppressive darkness of the descent slowly gave way to a sickly, pulsating glow. This was the Rust Abyss, a sprawling subterranean black market city built into the cavernous, forgotten foundations of the planet. Tangled webs of flickering neon tubes bathed the crowded metallic streets in harsh pinks and bruised blues. Cyborgs with exposed, rusted chrome limbs and exiled, desperate humans moved like ghosts through the choking smog of cheap synthetic vapor. The noise was deafening, a chaotic symphony of grinding gears, black market vendors shouting in broken dialects, and the heavy bass of underground fusion reactors. Ernest parked the rover in a shadowed alleyway, cloaking its thermal signature. His plan was straightforward, but dangerous. He needed to find a specific smuggler, a contact from his past who could bypass the orbital blockades. He intended to trade the highly classified black box for Lyra's safe passage off this dying rock, sending her back to her native alien colony. He gripped the girl's small shoulder, guiding her through the chaotic crowds, keeping the heavy cylindrical device hidden deep within his oversized coat. But biology, unlike machinery, could not simply be switched off. As they navigated the labyrinthine lower markets, Lyra's innate bioluminescence began to react to the proximity of the black box. Her skin pulsed with a rapid, blinding ultraviolet light. The device in Ernest's pocket answered, emitting a deep, subaudible hum. A massive wave of biological resonance washed over the entire district. It was an involuntary electromagnetic pulse. Streetlights shattered in showers of sparks. Digital vendor displays violently short-circuited. The underground city plunged into a sudden, terrified panic. They had unknowingly broadcast a beacon. Heavy metallic thuds echoed through the narrow alley behind them. A notorious gang of heavily augmented mercenary cyborgs blocked their only exit. Their leader, a towering mass of weaponized steel with glowing optic sensors instead of eyes, raised a heavy railgun. He did not aim at Ernest. He pointed the massive weapon directly at Lyra. "The corporation pays well for the data," the cyborg snarled, his voice a distorted mechanical grind. "But the girl is the physical key. Her DNA unlocks the ancient energy cores. Take the human out, we take the alien alive." The mercenaries charged, drawing jagged, electrically charged blades. Ernest did not reach for the rusted kinetic pistol on his hip. Brute force was a fool's game against armor plating. Instead, His mind worked with the blistering speed of a master engineer. He accessed his wrist-mounted diagnostic terminal, tapping directly into the underground city's poorly shielded infrastructure. He targeted the main high-pressure plasma conduit, running along the ceiling, directly above the advancing mercenaries. With 3 rapid keystrokes, he bypassed the safety regulators and overloaded the primary pressure valves. The heavy iron pipe ruptured violently. A blinding, localized sunburst of pure thermal light and roaring white noise erupted in the narrow space. The extreme flash instantly overloaded and permanently burned out the optical sensors of every cyborg in the alley, while the mercenaries thrashed blindly in the sparks and steam. Ernest grabbed Lyra's hand and sprinted through the smoke, escaping into the deeper, unseen layers of the slums. They finally reached the rusted-out docking bay of Ernest's smuggler contact. The smuggler, an old man with a face half replaced by synthetic skin, listened to Ernest's desperate plea. Then, he let out a harsh, rasping laugh that sounded like tearing metal. Send her home," the smuggler mocked, pointing a shaking cybernetic finger at the glowing girl. "There is no home, Ernest. Her colony was burned to ash 10 years ago. The corporation wiped them out to the last child. Her mother was not just a low-level dome laborer. She was a rogue geneticist. She spent a decade hiding among the slaves. That box you are holding is not corporate data. It is the ecological seed." The revelation hit Ernest like a physical blow. The corporation was not hunting stolen weapon schematics. They were hunting a cure, realizing there was absolutely no safe harbor left in the known galaxy. Ernest shoved the smuggler aside, dragged Lyra back to the rover, and drove them completely off the mapped grid. They plunged deeper into the planet's dead crust, eventually breaking through a massive collapsed bulkhead. The headlights of the rover swept across an impossible, awe-inspiring sight. They had entered the tower graveyard. Colossal, monolithic structures of dark, silent metal pierced the cavern ceilings, stretching up into the darkness like the bones of dead gods. These were the original terraforming machines, monumental feats of hard science fiction engineering that had been abandoned by the corporation nearly half a century ago. The sheer, terrifying scale of the silent machinery made the rover look like a speck of dust. Ernest drove them to the very center of the graveyard, parking at the base of the largest central command spire. They climbed the long, dark, spiraling staircases until they reached the primary control hub. The room was a massive cathedral of dead screens and dust-covered command consoles. Guided by an instinct she did not fully understand, Lyra stepped up to the central monolithic console. She pulled the black box from Ernest's hands and firmly pushed it into a perfectly sized, recessed docking port. The ancient command center violently shuddered to life. The room flooded with a pure, blindingly clean blue light, sweeping away decades of shadows. A massive, towering hologram materialized in the center of the room. It was Lyra's mother, her image composed of millions of floating data points. As the system booted up, endless lines of deep source code began to scroll rapidly across the giant wall monitors. Ernest stared at the cascading numbers, his breath caught in his throat, his hardened, stoic demeanor completely shattered. He slowly collapsed to his knees on the rusted floor, his eyes wide with a profound, agonizing horror. "I wrote this," Ernest whispered, his voice cracking violently. 40 years ago. I wrote every single line of this architecture." He looked up at Lyra, tears cutting through the thick dirt on his face. He finally revealed his darkest, most closely guarded secret. He was not a simple wasteland scavenger. Decades ago, he was the chief architectural engineer for the corporation. He had designed these magnificent towers to heal the broken world, to scrub the atmosphere and create a paradise. But the corporation realized that a clean planet meant free air. There was no profit in a cured world. They forcibly altered his designs, reversing the atmospheric scrubbers to actively produce the toxic storms, ensuring the desperate population would forever pay exorbitant fees to live inside the heavily taxed ecodomes. Disgusted and broken by his own creation, Ernest had fled into the wasteland, carrying the weight of a murdered planet on his shoulders. The towering hologram of Lyra's mother began to speak, her voice echoing with a deep, tragic sadness, but also an unyielding hope. She explained the ultimate truth. Lyra's unique, glowing physiology was not a random mutation. Her biology was a perfectly engineered molecular filter. Lyra was not a useless, exiled laborer. She was the living, breathing biological catalyst. She was the only key capable of overriding the corrupted corporate code and permanently rebooting the entire planetary purification grid. The corporation had not simply expelled Lyra because her mother died. They had discovered her true genetic nature. They pushed a 12-year-old girl out into the freezing electrostatic storm so she would die a quiet, legally deniable death. They wanted the planet to execute the only threat to their absolute monopoly on clean oxygen. Ernest slowly stood up. He looked at the colossal machinery he had built to save the world. Machinery that had been used to enslave it. Then, he looked at the fragile, glowing child who held the power to fix his greatest failure. A fierce, uncompromising fire ignited in the old engineer's eyes. He had run from his guilt for 40 long years. He would run no further. He reached down, chambering a heavy round into his kinetic pistol. He silently vowed to protect this little girl with every last drop of blood in his veins, knowing that seeing her complete the planetary purification was the only chance he would ever have to finally save his own soul. The awakening of the Central Command Spire was not a quiet affair. As the ancient systems roared to life, a blinding, vertical pillar of raw, unfiltered azure energy shot straight up from the peak of the tower. It tore through the subterranean bedrock, punched a massive hole in the toxic clouds above, and slammed directly into the upper stratosphere. In the cold vacuum of space, the corporate orbital defense grid instantly registered the catastrophic power surge. Sirens wailed across their immaculate, sterile command decks. Within 60 seconds, heavily armed orbital dropships were detached, plummeting through the atmosphere like burning meteors. They carried an entire battalion of merciless combat synthetics and elite, heavily armored special operations soldiers. Their strict, unyielding orders were simple: annihilate the tower and everything breathing inside it. Deep within the central control hub, the colossal hologram of Lyra's mother turned its glowing eyes toward the trembling child. The biological synchronization process must begin immediately, the mechanical voice echoed. You must step into the primary fusion core. The sequence will take exactly 2 hours. During this time, your consciousness will merge with the planetary grid. You will be entirely defenseless. Lyra looked at Ernest, her bioluminescence flashing a terrified, frantic yellow. Ernest knelt down, placing his heavy, calloused hands on her small shoulders. You go in there, kid, he said, his voice steady, carrying the heavy weight of absolute resolve. You save this world. I will make sure nothing comes through those doors. Lyra nodded slowly. She stepped backward into the massive, circular glass chamber at the heart of the room. The heavy blast doors hissed shut, locking her inside a swirling vortex of glowing, conductive fluid. Ernest watched her for just a moment, then turned his back to the core. He had precisely 120 minutes to hold off an entire corporate army. He walked over to the primary architectural terminal. He did not need to hack the system. He knew every single backdoor, every hidden defensive protocol, because he had written them all with his own hands 4 decades ago. His fingers flew across the rusted keyboard. He rerouted the tower's internal power grid, turning the massive structure into a deadly, inescapable fortress. The first wave of corporate combat synthetics breached the lower levels. Hundreds of sleek, Silver machines marched in perfect, terrifying unison up the spiraling ramps, their thermal rifles scanning for targets. They expected an empty ruin. Instead, Ernest triggered the first trap. He overloaded the primary magnetic coils, hidden within the walls of the third sector. A massive, invisible electromagnetic pulse violently exploded outward. The entire wave of advancing synthetics convulsed violently, their internal circuits instantly frying. They collapsed into useless, smoking piles of scrap metal. But the corporation did not care about lost machines. The second wave, comprised of elite human soldiers clad in heavy, powered exoskeleton suits, simply stepped over the mechanical corpses. They moved with brutal, calculated precision, blowing through heavy bulkheads with shaped charges. Ernest tracked their movements on his monitors. As the soldiers entered the narrow, hyper-pressurized maintenance corridor on the 50th floor, Ernest slammed his fist onto a red override command. He instantly inverted the atmospheric pressure regulators. The massive airlocks at both ends of the corridor slammed shut. The pressure inside the hallway instantly dropped to an absolute vacuum. The soldiers clutched their throats, their advanced suits struggling to compensate before the glass visors of their helmets violently shattered outward. The old engineer did not stop moving. He abandoned the control terminal, ripping a massive, heavy-duty industrial mining laser from a nearby emergency locker. He hauled the incredibly heavy weapon to the final choke point, a narrow titanium bridge leading directly into the core room. He braced himself behind a thick steel barricade. The surviving corporate forces finally broke through the main double doors. Ernest squeezed the trigger of the mining laser. A blinding, searing beam of concentrated superheated plasma roared down the bridge. It sliced effortlessly through the heavily armored soldiers, melting their protective gear and the flesh underneath in a split second. The air filled with the horrific, sickening stench of burning ozone and vaporized metal. Ernest held the trigger down, his face a mask of pure, fiery determination. He was a man fighting for his own redemption, and he fought with the terrifying ferocity of a cornered beast. "Hold the line!" he screamed, his voice tearing through his raw throat. "You are not taking her!" But the mining laser's power cell rapidly drained, flashing a critical red warning. Exactly at that moment, the ceiling above the bridge violently exploded inward. A massive, heavily weaponized mechanical suit dropped down from the upper maintenance shafts. It was the strike team commander. The colossal machine stood 9 feet tall, armed with hydraulic crushing claws and dual rotary cannons. Before Ernest could pivot his heavy weapon, the commander swung a massive mechanical fist. The brutal impact shattered Ernest's barricade and launched the old man backward across the steel floor. Ernest gasped in agony as he felt several ribs snap. He tried to scramble to his feet, but the commander stepped forward, bringing a heavy metal boot down squarely onto Ernest's chest. The sickening sound of tearing fabric echoed through the room. The thick environmental survival suit Ernest wore was violently ripped open. Instantly, the toxic, sulfur-heavy atmosphere from the breached upper levels flooded the room. Ernest gasped, his lungs immediately filling with the lethal poison he had engineered decades ago. He coughed violently, thick, dark blood spraying from his lips onto the rusted floor. He was suffocating, his vision swimming with dark, jagged edges. "A pathetic end for a traitor." The commander's heavily digitized voice boomed from the mechanical suit. The towering machine raised its rotary cannons, aiming them directly at the glass chamber where Lyra floated. Her eyes closed in deep biological synchronization. Ernest looked at the timer on his cracked wrist display. There were exactly 5 minutes left until Lyra finished her sequence. 5 minutes. He could not fight the machine. He could not fix his suit. But he was the chief architect, and he always built a failsafe. Ignoring the agonizing pain in his shattered chest, Ernest reached out with a trembling, blood-soaked hand. He grabbed a heavy wrench from his belt and smashed it brutally against the commander's knee joint, forcing the machine to stumble backward for just a brief second. Using that tiny window of time, Ernest dragged his broken body across the floor, leaving a thick trail of blood behind him. He threw himself under the primary manual control desk. He ripped open a hidden panel, exposing a large, heavy mechanical lever. It was the manual override for the tower's subterranean nuclear reactor. Pulling it would initiate an immediate, uncontainable meltdown, collapsing the entire mountain of steel and burying the corporate army under millions of tons of burning rubble. It would also incinerate the immediate vicinity. His breath came in wet, shallow, agonizing gasps. The toxic air was tearing his internal organs apart. He looked back at Lyra, her purple light shining brighter and more steady than ever before. She was so close. 5 minutes, kid, Ernest whispered, blood pouring down his chin. He smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile that wiped away 40 years of crushing guilt. I bought you 5 minutes. The commander recovered, letting out a furious mechanical roar, and charged forward to execute the old man. But it was too late. Ernest wrapped both of his bloody hands around the heavy lever and pulled it down with all the strength he had left in this world, fully expecting the blinding flash of a nuclear fire to consume them all and end the nightmare. But the agonizing blast never came. Instead, the heavy lever locked into place with a dull clank, completely dead. The countdown timer on his cracked wrist display froze permanently at 0 seconds. A sudden, deafening harmonic chime resonated through the thick metal walls of the central command spire. The towering mechanical commander, poised to deliver a fatal strike, froze completely rigid mid-air. Its heavy rotary cannons whined loudly as they lost all power, and the terrifying glowing red sensors in its head faded to pitch black. The entire orbital defense grid and the sprawling mercenary army had been instantly hijacked. The black box had never simply been a storage drive for an ecological seed. It secretly held the fully preserved, brilliant consciousness of Lyra's mother. The exact moment the biological synchronization was complete, her mind uploaded directly into the planetary mainframe, instantly overriding every single corporate command protocol across the entire globe and permanently shutting down their lethal weapons of oppression. The colossal terraforming tower began to violently tremble, shaking the very foundations of the earth beneath them. But this was not the tremor of destruction. It was the undeniable, earth-shattering roar of rebirth. High above the poisoned, desolate wasteland, the impenetrable, sickly black clouds were violently torn apart. A magnificent, blinding shockwave of pure, deep azure light exploded across the horizon, forcefully pushing away a century of darkness. For the first time in over 100 years, the massive atmospheric scrubbers built deep within the tower roared to their true, intended life. They did not spew toxic smog to enslave the population. Instead, they unleashed a massive, planetary storm of pure, unadulterated oxygen, pumping life directly back into the dead sky with the raw, untamed power of a hurricane. Lying broken on the rusted floor, Ernest squeezed his eyes shut. He waited for his lungs to finally collapse, waiting for the lethal sulfur gas to drag him into the cold abyss of death. He accepted his fate completely. But suddenly, a violent fit of coughing racked his broken chest. He gasped, his lungs desperately pulling in the surrounding air. His eyes snapped open in sheer disbelief. The air was no longer burning his throat. It felt incredibly crisp, painfully cold, and impossibly sweet. The lethal, heavy toxins lingering in the room had been instantly neutralized at the molecular level, completely cleansed by the biological catalyst radiating outward from the core. He took another deep, shuddering breath, crying out softly as the clean oxygen flooded his starving bloodstream. He was actually breathing. The heavy glass blast doors of the primary fusion core hissed loudly as they unsealed and slowly opened. Lyra stepped out into the command center. Her skin no longer flickered with the jagged, fearful violet light of a terrified, abandoned child. She glowed with a brilliant, steady, and profoundly warm luminescence. She was a living, breathing beacon of the newly restored world. Seeing the old man bleeding on the floor, she ran across the rusted metal plates and threw her small arms tightly around his neck. Ernest slowly wrapped his heavy, dirt-streaked arms around her, burying his face into her shoulder. The hardened, cynical wasteland scavenger collapsed into tears, weeping openly with a mixture of profound grief for the past and overwhelming joy for the present. He held his adopted daughter close, laughing through his tears, a beautiful sound he had entirely forgotten how to make. Across the dying planet, a miraculous transformation was taking place. The heavy titanium gates of the numerous corporate ecodomes groaned as their automated locks failed, slowly swinging wide open. Hesitant, terrified citizens stepped cautiously out of their cramped, artificial prisons and looked up. The sky above them was a breathtaking, endless canvas of clear, brilliant blue. The rusted, metallic dunes that had choked the landscape for generations began to rapidly dissolve, broken down by the newly released molecular enzymes riding the wind. In their place, the dark, nutrient-rich soil of a healed world emerged. Tiny, impossible green sprouts of genuine vegetation pushed their way up through the dirt, reaching eagerly toward the warm sunlight. The planet was finally breathing again. Sometime later, high above the clouds, Ernest and Lyra stood together on the open observation deck at the very peak of the colossal tower. The gentle wind whipped around them, carrying the long, forgotten scent of fresh rain and wet earth. The golden, warm light of a true, unfiltered sunrise washed over their faces, painting the horizon in shades of fire and gold. Ernest was no longer a guilty scavenger, hiding in the ruins of his own terrible sins. Lyra was no longer a condemned exile, waiting to die in the freezing cold. They stood closely, side by side, looking out over the vast, endless expanse of the healed world, quietly watching the dawn of a brand new era of absolute freedom. Thank you so very much, dear listeners, for staying with us until the very end of this incredible journey on Z Sci-Fi Stories. We would love to know, where in the world are you listening to this story from today? Please let us know in the comments below. If you truly enjoyed today's adventure and felt the warmth of this new world, we humbly ask for your help. Please consider supporting our channel with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the PayPal link provided in the video description and pinned comment. Your incredible generosity allows us to pay our dedicated staff, helping them feed their families and keeping this channel alive so we can continue creating better and more thrilling sci-fi stories for you. Thank you once again, and we will see you in the next adventure.